dictated the United States Army had just made its choice. The semi-automatic rifle competition was over, the winner was decided, and the Johnson M1941 was not it. The Army had chosen the Garand, the M1, the rifle that Patton would later call the greatest battle implement ever devised. The decision was official, the contracts were signed, and the Johnson was done. Except it wasn't, because in the years that followed, a small, unconventional, privately designed rifle built by a Marine Corps Reserve officer and a Massachusetts Firearms company would find its way into the hands of some of the most elite fighting men in American history. Dutch resistance fighters, Marine raiders, OSS operatives working behind enemy lines, and paratroopers who needed a rifle that could be broken down, smuggled into a combat drop, and reassembled under fire. The US Army never wanted the Johnson M1941, but the men who carried it into battle often refused to give it up. This is the story of the rifle that lost the war contract and then went to war anyway. Long pause. To understand why the Johnson existed, you have to understand what American infantrymen were carrying in the late 1930s and why military personnel, Tidanas, were desperate to replace it. For decades, the standard issue American infantry rifle was the Springfield M1903, a bolt-action weapon. Accurate, reliable, well-respected. But by the mid-1930s, European armies were beginning to shift towards semi-automatic designs. A soldier with a bolt-action rifle had to manually cycle each round. One shot, one action. One shot, one action. In a firefight, that cost time, and time cost lives. The US Army recognized this. They wanted a semi-automatic rifle, a weapon that would fire a new round each time the trigger was pulled, without the soldier having to manually work the bolt. Faster fire, more sustained suppression, better odds of surviving contact. The trials were intense. Multiple designs were submitted and tested, and by 1936, the Army had provisionally selected the M1 Garand, a gas-operated, en-bloc clip-fed, 8-round semi-automatic rifle that would go on to define American infantry combat across 2 theaters of war. But the Garand had problems. Early production models had reliability issues, and not everyone in the military establishment was convinced the competition was truly closed. Into that gap stepped one man with a difference. There is no idea. Melvin Johnson Jr. was not a professional engineer in the traditional sense. He was a Marine Corps Reserve officer, a lawyer by training, and a firearms enthusiast with a deep understanding of mechanical design. By the mid-1930s, Johnson had developed a semi-automatic rifle concept built around a short-recoil operating system, a fundamentally different mechanical approach from the Garand's long-stroke gas piston. He believed his system offered real advantages. He also believed the Army's procurement process had not given competitors a fair evaluation. Johnson began developing his rifle seriously around 1936, and by 1938, he was submitting it for formal military trials. The rifle was manufactured in partnership with the Cranston Arms Company in Providence, Rhode Island. It was chambered for the standard US 36 Springfield cartridge, the same round as the Garand and the M1903, meaning ammunition compatibility was not a concern. The Army tested it, and then they tested it, and then they tested it again, and in the end they passed. The official reasoning was partly practical and partly institutional. The Garand was already in production. Switching to a new design would disrupt its supply chains, retrain armorers, and delay fielding. The Army had made its decision and was committed to it. But Johnson did not give up, because someone else was interested. The Netherlands, specifically the Dutch colonial government managing the Dutch East Indies, was shopping for semi-automatic rifles in the late 1930s. Facing the growing threat of Japanese expansion in the Pacific, they needed weapons, and they needed them quickly. American production capacity for the Garand was already stretched. Johnson offered an alternative. An order was placed. The Johnson M1941 went into production, and the rifle that the US Army had formerly rejected was now being manufactured and shipped for war. What made Johnson think differently about rifle design came down to one core principle: recoil management through mechanical simplicity. The Garand used a long-stroke gas piston system. Gas from a fired cartridge was tapped from the barrel, drove a piston rearward, and cycled the action. It was proven, but it was also a fixed system. Once the gas port and piston geometry were locked in, adjusting for different ammunition loads was not straightforward. Johnson's approach was different. His TID rifle used a short-recoil system based on a rotating bolt. When the cartridge fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance, then unlocked and separated. The bolt continued rearward to eject the spent case and chamber a fresh round. The system was more mechanically sensitive in some ways, but it also had a distinctly lighter recoil impulse. Johnson himself argued that his system's lower felt recoil meant faster target requisition. A soldier could fire, recover, and fire again more quickly. In semi-automatic shooting, this was a genuine tactical point. He also made a design decision that would prove critically important for one specific group of users. The barrel on the Johnson M1941 could be removed. In a conventional bolt action or gas-operated semi-automatic, barrel removal required tools and time. On the Johnson, it was a deliberate feature, a quick-detach system, that allowed the rifle to be broken into a more compact package for transport, for paratroopers jumping out of aircraft, for special operations teams moving through confined spaces. For men who needed to conceal a full-sized battle rifle, this was not a minor detail. It was a tactical advantage. TID the Army rifle simply could not match. TID the Johnson M1941 was a full-length semi-automatic rifle chambered in .36 Springfield. It measured approximately 45.9 inches overall with the barrel attached, and weighed around 9.5 pounds, unloaded slightly lighter than early production M1 Garands. The action was built around a rotating bolt with multiple locking lugs, using the short-recoil operating principle. The barrel could be detached from the receiver without tools using a simple interrupted thread coupling a mechanical feature, TID that set it apart visually and practically from contemporary designs. The magazine system was distinctive. Rather than the Garand's fixed N-block clip, the Johnson used a rotary box magazine holding 10 rounds. This was one more round than the Garand's 8-round capacity, and it offered a significant logistical flexibility the Garand could not match. The Johnson's magazine could be topped off with individual rounds or standard 5-round stripper clips at any point, even partially loaded. With TID the Garand, if you had fired 3 rounds and wanted to reload before a firefight, you either loaded a full new clip, ejecting the remaining rounds, or you waited. The Johnson could accept a partial top-off at any moment. For men in close combat or special operations, that flexibility mattered. The stock was a conventional wooden design with a pistol grip configuration that many users found comfortable. The trigger mechanism was generally praised for a clean break and reasonable pull weight, TID contributing to the rifle's reputation for accuracy in the hands of trained shooters. Field stripping was straightforward, and the removable barrel meant the entire rifle could be broken into 2 primary sections for transport, something no standard US infantry rifle of the era could do. The Johnson M1941 fired the .36 Springfield cartridge around with a muzzle velocity of cache, approximately 2,800 feet per second from a full-length barrel, and an effective combat range well past 500 yards. In TID terms of raw ballistics, the Johnson was equivalent to the Garand, the M1903, and any other .3006 platform of the era. The cartridge itself was not in question. What mattered was how the rifle delivered it. The semi-automatic action gave the Johnson the same fundamental advantage all semi-automatic designs offered in this period: the ability to deliver follow-up shots without breaking the firing position. A trained rifleman could maintain aimed fire at a rate the best bolt-action users simply TID could not match under stress. The 10-round capacity, combined with the ability to top off at any time, gave Johnson users a genuine edge in sustained fire situations. A patrol under contact could feed rounds into the rifle during brief lulls without committing to a full reload cycle. Independent accuracy testing conducted during the procurement trials found the Johnson to be at least as accurate as the M1 Garand, and some contemporary testers rated it slightly superior in accuracy at longer TID ranges. The felt recoil, by multiple accounts, was noticeably lighter than the Garand. Whether this was a decisive combat advantage or a marginal benefit depended heavily on the shooter, but experienced riflemen consistently noted it as a positive characteristic. The removable barrel was not a firepower feature, but it was a capability feature. A rifle that could be field stripped into a compact package and reassembled rapidly was a different category of weapon for certain missions. For TID paratroopers, it was not just convenient, it was essential. The Johnson M1941 entered operational service through an unusual path, and it proved itself through an equally unusual collection of users. The Dutch order was the first operational deployment. The rifles were shipped for Dutch colonial forces in the East Indies, where they saw combat during the Japanese invasion of early 1942. Dutch colonial troops fought desperate rearguard actions across the Indonesian archipelago before the TID territory fell. The Johnson was one of the weapons in their hands during those fights. It performed reliably enough in that tropical environment to earn no serious complaints from its users, a quiet but meaningful endorsement given the conditions. But the rifle's most significant American combat role came through two specific channels: the Marine Corps and the Office of Strategic Services. The 1st Marine Parachute Battalion, the Marine Raiders Parachute Element, adopted the Johnson M1941 as TID their primary rifle. The reason was straightforward and practical. Standard US paratroopers jumped with their weapons secured in padded cases or worn awkwardly on their bodies. The M1 Garand's fixed configuration made this difficult. The Johnson's removable barrel meant it could be broken down, packed more compactly, and reassembled after landing. For men jumping into combat, this was a serious operational advantage. The Marine paratroopers carried the Johnson into combat in the Pacific on TID Gavutu Tanambogo in August 1942 during the broader Guadalcanal campaign. Marine parachutists went into action with their Johnsons against heavily dug-in Japanese positions. The rifle functioned. The men who carried it reported confidence in it. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence and special operations organization, also acquired Johnsons for certain operatives. Small numbers of the rifles were used in operations behind enemy lines in Europe and Asia. TID where reliability, accuracy, and the ability to conceal or transport the weapon were priorities. The common thread across every group that chose the Johnson was the same. These were men who had options, and they picked the Johnson anyway. That is not a trivial observation. Marine Raiders and OSS operatives were not standard infantry units, issued whatever came down the supply chain. They evaluated weapons and selected what worked. Their choice of the Johnson over the Garand in the situations, TID where they had that choice, says something about what the rifle actually offered in the field. Accounts from Pacific combat describe Japanese infantry encountering the semi-automatic. Fire from Marine positions with surprise and alarm, a reaction not unique to the Johnson, but consistent with the documented pattern of Japanese troops underestimating the volume of aimed fire American semi-automatic rifles could produce. A 10-round magazine that could be topped off mid-fight in the hands of a TID-trained Marine was a weapon that did not announce when it was empty. The Johnson M1941 was not without serious problems, and honest history requires stating them clearly. The short-recoil operating system, while mechanically elegant, was more sensitive to ammunition variation than the Garand's gas-operated design. The rifle was calibrated for standard commercial and military .36 ammunition. When fed non-standard loads, greased cartridges, or out-of-spec rounds, reliability could suffer. In TID the Pacific, where ammunition quality and storage conditions were sometimes inconsistent, this was a genuine concern. The rotary magazine, while flexible in terms of loading, was also a weak point. The magazine was integral to the rifle. It could not be swapped out in the field as quickly as a detachable box magazine design. If the magazine was damaged, the rifle was effectively out of action. The barrel, for all its advantages as a removable feature, introduced a potential reliability issue. TID the interrupted thread coupling that allowed quick removal also had to withstand the stresses of sustained rapid fire. Under heavy use, the barrel fit could loosen, affecting accuracy and function. The rifle was also never manufactured at scale. Total production of the Johnson M1941 across all variants was somewhere in the range of 70,000 rifles, a fraction of the millions of M1 Garands produced. This limited production meant spare parts were scarce, armorer training was limited, and logistical support structure that makes a military rifle sustainable in long campaigns simply did not exist for the Johnson. These were not small problems. A weapon that performs well in the right conditions, but struggles with ammunition variation, has a vulnerable magazine, and cannot be resupplied or repaired easily, is a weapon with a short operational ceiling in sustained conventional warfare. The Army's decision to stay with the Garand, whatever the politics involved, was not wrong. The Garand was the right choice for mass infantry use. The Johnson was something different, a weapon for specialists, not for a division. The direct comparison between the Johnson M1941 and the M1 Garand is inevitable, and it is more nuanced than the outcome of the procurement trials suggests. The Garand was a more robust design for mass production and sustained conventional use. Its gas-operated system was less sensitive to ammunition variation. Its fixed barrel, while limiting for transport, was structurally sound. And once the Army worked through early production issues, the Garand proved extraordinarily reliable across every theater of the war. Millions were made, logistics chains were built around it. It became the backbone of American infantry firepower. The Johnson was not better than the Garand for standard infantry use, but it was better for specific missions. The removable barrel was a genuine advantage the Garand could not match. The 10-round capacity with top-off capability was a genuine advantage the Garand's en-bloc clip could not match. The lighter felt recoil was a genuine advantage for precision shooting, and the trigger, by most assessments, was superior. Where the Johnson suffered in comparison was in durability under sustained fire, logistical supportability, ammunition sensitivity, and production. Action scalability. For a standard infantry squad fighting across months of campaign, those factors dominate. For a 12-man raider team jumping into a Pacific island, they dominate less. The comparison with the German WWII 41 and WWII 43, the semi-automatic designs Germany fielded during the same period, is also instructive. Both were heavier, more complex, and less well-liked by their users than the American designs. The Johnson, for all its procurement difficulties, was in many ways a more refined semi-automatic concept than what Germany managed to field before the war ended. The Johnson M1941 mattered not because it was the best rifle of the war, but because it demonstrated that the best rifle for every situation is not always the same rifle. The Johnson M1941 faded quickly after the war. Production had already been limited, and with the Garand dominating American inventory and the M14 in development for the post-war era, there was no institutional home for the Johnson. Melvin Johnson continued working in firearms design after the war. He developed a light machine gun variant, the Johnson M1944 LMG, that shared components with the rifle and saw limited use with some special operations units. He also contributed design work on weapons that influenced later American military development, though the direct lineage is difficult to trace in clean documented lines. The rifle's most enduring legacy is less about specific mechanical descendants and more about what it proved in principle. The Johnson demonstrated that the special operations community had weapons needs that did not align with standard infantry procurement logic. The Marine Raiders, the OSS, the Dutch colonial forces, these were all organizations operating outside standard doctrine, in situations where a rifle's ability to be broken down, topped off mid-fight, or simply trusted by a small team operating without a logistics tail, mattered as much as raw firepower or production simplicity. After the war, American special operations thinking continued to develop, and the idea that elite units needed weapons specifically suited to their missions, rather than whatever the standard Army procurement system produced, became increasingly institutionalized. The Johnson was not the origin of that idea, but it was an early, concrete, combat-proven example of it. Today, the Johnson M1941 is a company, collector's piece. Original examples are relatively scarce given the low production numbers, and they command serious prices at auction among firearms collectors and military history enthusiasts. Museums, including the National Firearms Museum in the United States, hold examples of the rifle, and it remains a subject of genuine interest among students of World War II small arms. The rifle that lost the contract, that found its users anyway. That terrified Japanese infantry in the Pacific, not through numbers, but through the hands of the men who chose it. That is the Johnson M1941's legacy. Not volume, not doctrine, not institutional endorsement, choice. The US Army rejected the Johnson M1941. The official decision was made. The Garand was the American rifle of the Second World War, and history has validated that choice at scale. But the men who jumped into Pacific Islands with Johnson rifles, disassembled in their jump packs, the OSS operatives who chose it for missions where the margin for error was zero, the Dutch soldiers who carried it into the last stands against Japanese invasion, they made a different calculation. They were not wrong either. The Johnson M1941 is proof tit hat. A weapon does not need to win the contract to win the fight. It needs to be in the right hands, at the right moment, doing the thing it was built to do. That is what made it dangerous, not the Army's approval. The Army's rejection was just the beginning. If this kind of detailed military history is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed. There are more stories like this one, weapons that were underestimated, overlooked, or written off before they proved their worth.